What if I told you that one of the most powerful drug lords in American history operated not out of New York, not out of Miami, not out of Los Angeles, but out of St. Louis, Missouri? And what if I told you he didn't hide behind violence and intimidation alone, he hid behind religion, that he built his empire inside a mosque, wrapped it in the language of Black empowerment and spiritual discipline, and used the cover of faith to move heroin across an entire region for over a decade? Meet Jerry Lewis Bey, the man St. Louis tried to forget, the man the federal government spent years trying to catch, the man whose organization was so deeply embedded in the city's fabric that even after his arrest, people weren't sure whether to condemn him or mourn him. This is not a simple story. Nothing about Jerry Lewis Bey ever was. Stay with me. To understand Jerry Lewis Bey, you have to understand St. Louis, because St. Louis in the 1970s and 1980s was a city undergoing a slow, agonizing identity crisis. Once one of America's great industrial powerhouses, St. Louis had been a gateway city, a manufacturing hub, a place where working-class families, Black and white, could build something resembling stability. The Mississippi River made it a commercial artery. The factories made it livable. The neighborhoods that grew up around those factories were tight-knit, proud communities with their own economies, institutions, and culture. And then, like Detroit, like Cleveland, like so many other Midwestern cities, St. Louis started coming apart. The manufacturing base eroded through the 1970s as plants closed, automated, or relocated south, chasing cheaper, non-union labor. The population collapsed. St. Louis went from nearly 860,000 people in 1950 to under 450,000 by the 1980s, one of the most dramatic urban population losses in American history. White flight gutted the tax base. Federal highway projects had already carved up and destroyed several historically Black neighborhoods in the 1950s and 60s. The Mill Creek Valley demolition alone displaced over 20,000 Black residents, a wound the community never fully healed from. What was left were neighborhoods stripped of economic opportunity, political power, and institutional investment. High unemployment, deteriorating schools, a generation of young Black men with no clear path forward, and into that landscape came heroin. Then, later, crack. The drugs didn't create the desperation, they fed on it. This was the St. Louis that Jerry Lewis Bey grew up in and eventually came to dominate. Here's what makes the Jerry Lewis Bey story different from almost every other drug lord narrative you've ever heard. He didn't operate from a street corner, he operated from a temple. Jerry Lewis Bey was a leader within the Moorish Science Temple of America, a Black nationalist religious organization founded in 1913 by Noble Drew Ali. The Moorish Science Temple taught that Black Americans were descended from the ancient Moors, that their true nationality was Moorish American, and that reclaiming this identity was the path to liberation from racial oppression. It was a serious theological and cultural tradition with a long history in Black America, one that had genuine spiritual meaning for thousands of followers. Jerry Lewis Bey used all of it, cynically, deliberately, brilliantly. He understood something fundamental about the community around him. People who had been failed by every mainstream American institution, the government, the economy, the school system, the church, were hungry for an alternative framework, something that gave them dignity, identity, and community. The Moorish Science Temple offered all of that. So did Jerry Lewis Bey on the surface. He presented himself as a community leader, a man of faith, someone invested in Black uplift and self-determination. He ran legitimate businesses. He had followers who genuinely believed in him. He cultivated relationships with community figures and local institutions that gave him a veneer of respectability that most drug operators could never have dreamed of. Underneath all of it, he was running one of the most sophisticated heroin distribution networks in the Midwest. The organization used the temple structure, its hierarchy, its internal communication systems, its network of members across multiple cities as infrastructure for the drug operation. It was a masterstroke of criminal architecture. Law enforcement couldn't just look at a known gang hangout or a notorious street corner. They had to penetrate a religious organization with sincere members mixed in alongside criminal ones, which created enormous legal and investigative complications. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Jerry Lewis Bey methodically expanded his operation. Heroin was the product, St. Louis was the base, but the network stretched across Missouri and into neighboring states, an interstate operation at a time when most drug organizations were much more locally contained. Supply came in, got processed and cut, and moved out through a distribution chain that investigators later described as remarkably organized. The money was substantial. Estimates from federal investigators suggested the operation was generating millions annually, not the billion-dollar-a-day figures of the Chambers brothers at their absolute peak, but consistent, sustained revenue over a much longer period, which in some ways made it more dangerous. This wasn't a flash in the pan. This was an institution. And because of the religious cover, the heat came more slowly. Local law enforcement in St. Louis knew something was happening. Street-level intelligence, informants, the basic realities of policing a city with a serious heroin problem, it all pointed toward a sophisticated organization with leadership somewhere. But identifying that leadership, building a case against it, and doing so in a way that would survive federal prosecution was another matter entirely. Meanwhile, St. Louis was living through the consequences in real time. The heroin epidemic that gripped St. Louis through the 1980s was devastating in ways that don't always get the same attention as the crack epidemic in other cities. Partly because heroin's destruction was sometimes slower, more hidden, more domestic, but it was real. Communities on the north side of St. Louis, already hammered by deindustrialization and disinvestment, were further hollowed out. Addiction ripped through families. Children grew up with addicted parents. Men died of overdoses in apartments and alleys. The violence that inevitably accompanied the drug trade, disputes over territory, over money, over debts, added to a homicide rate that made St. Louis one of the most dangerous cities in America by the late 1980s. The city's murder rate in 1989 hit a record high. Multiple factors drove that number, but the drug trade was central among them. And here's the part that deserves honest examination. The communities experiencing this destruction were the same communities that had already been sacrificed by urban renewal projects, redlining, discriminatory lending, and the collapse of manufacturing employment. The institutions that should have protected and served those communities, like city government, federal investment programs, law enforcement, had largely failed them for decades. So when Jerry Lewis Bey showed up offering community, identity, structure, and in some cases literal employment, people responded. Not everyone who was connected to his orbit knew what they were connected to. Some did and didn't care because the alternatives looked worse. Some were true believers in the religious mission and had no knowledge of the criminal one. That complexity is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. Federal law enforcement eventually developed the tools and the will to take on the Lewis Bey organization seriously. The FBI and DEA coordinated what became a years-long investigation: wiretaps, informants, surveillance, financial tracking. The kind of patient, methodical federal investigation that's designed specifically to dismantle organizations rather than just arrest street-level operators. What they uncovered, piece by piece, was the full architecture of what Lewis Bey had built, the way the religious organization and the drug network intertwined, the money flows, the distribution chain, the hierarchy. One of the most dramatic elements of the investigation involved flipping insiders. Getting people within the organization to cooperate with federal prosecutors meant navigating both criminal loyalty and genuine religious devotion, a combination that made the usual pressure tactics more complicated. Some members who had been sincere believers felt profoundly betrayed when the true nature of the operation became clear. The indictments, when they came, were sweeping. Jerry Lewis Bey and numerous co-defendants faced federal drug conspiracy charges that carried severe sentencing exposure. The case laid out in specific documented detail how the operation had functioned and how the cover of religious community had shielded it for so long. The federal trial was a significant event in St. Louis. The scope of the charges, the prominence of the defendant, and the strange collision of organized crime and religious organization made it unlike anything the city had seen. The prosecution's case was built on the foundation of years of investigative work, wiretap recordings, financial records, testimony from cooperating witnesses. It was thorough. It was damning. The defense tried to argue, as defense teams in these cases often do, that the government had overreached, that the religious organization was being criminalized, that cooperating witnesses had their own motivations for testifying. There was some truth scattered in those arguments. There usually is. But the core evidence was overwhelming. Jerry Lewis Bey was convicted on federal drug conspiracy charges. His sentence was severe, reflecting both the scope of the operation and the mandatory minimum sentencing regime that governed federal drug cases in that era. The same 100-to-1 crack-to-powder disparity that had devastated communities around the country applied in spirit to the broader federal drug sentencing framework, harsh, sweeping, and falling with particular weight on Black defendants and their communities. He received a sentence that effectively meant the rest of his natural life behind bars. The Lewis Bey organization's dismantling didn't fix St. Louis. The structural problems that had made his rise possible, the economic devastation, the disinvestment, the collapse of legitimate opportunity, those didn't go away when the handcuffs went on. St. Louis continued to struggle with violent crime, poverty, and racial inequality in the decades that followed. The North Side neighborhoods that had been at the center of the heroin trade in the Lewis Bey era remained among the most economically distressed in the country. The city's population kept declining. The tax base kept shrinking. What the Lewis Bey case did leave behind was a complicated legacy that St. Louis has never fully resolved. Here was a man who spoke the language of Black liberation and self-determination while systematically destroying the community he claimed to uplift. Here was an organization that gave people genuine spiritual meaning while using that meaning as criminal cover. Here was a city that had been failed so thoroughly by legitimate institutions that the illegitimate ones filled the vacuum. The Moorish Science Temple of America itself, the broader organization, which had genuine members and genuine history completely separate from Lewis Bey's criminal enterprise, had to reckon publicly with how its name and structure had been exploited. And the people, the former followers, the family members, the community residents who had lived through all of it, they were left holding the weight of something that had no clean resolution. Addiction doesn't end when a kingpin goes to prison. Trauma doesn't heal because the source of it gets convicted. Communities don't rebuild overnight because a federal case closes. The Jerry Lewis Bey story sits at a very specific and painful intersection in American history. It's a story about what happens when a society strips communities of economic opportunity and then criminalizes the underground economies that grow in the vacuum. It's a story about how the language of Black empowerment and spiritual dignity, genuinely powerful, genuinely necessary language, can be weaponized by someone willing to exploit the hunger for it. It's a story about the limits of law enforcement as a solution to problems that are fundamentally economic and social. And it's a story about charisma, about the particular danger of a person who is genuinely intelligent, genuinely compelling, genuinely capable of inspiring people, pointed in the wrong direction. Jerry Lewis Bey didn't need to sell poison. He had real gifts, real organizational ability, real understanding of community and culture. In a different America, in a St. Louis where those gifts had legitimate avenues, where a Black man of his intellect and drive could have built something without choosing the underground, who knows what was possible? But that's not the America that existed. And Jerry Lewis Bey made the choices he made. St. Louis paid for them. His followers paid for them. The families destroyed by the heroin he moved paid for them. And ultimately, in a federal penitentiary, so did he. 3 God had his orange jumpsuit. Jerry Lewis Bey had his. The throne always ends the same way. If this hit, smash that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped American cities. Drop in the comments. What city do you want us to cover next?